On the 28th of June, 1914, a 19-year-old boy stepped onto a street in Sarajevo with a pistol in his hand. In less than 60 seconds, 2 shots rang out, and those 2 bullets didn't just kill a man. They killed 20 million people. They shattered 4 of the world's greatest empires. They redrew the map of the entire planet. And they planted the seeds of a second, even bloodier war, just 2 decades later. This is the story of World War I, the Great War. The war they promised would be over by Christmas, and instead lasted 4 devastating years. Stay until the end, because the world you live in today, the borders you see on maps, the conflicts you read about in the news, they all trace back to this one catastrophic war. Let's begin. To understand how 2 gunshots started a world war, you need to understand the Europe of 1914. Because Europe wasn't just a continent, it was a powder keg, and it had been for decades. Historians remember the causes with one word: Maine. By 1914, the great powers of Europe, Britain, Germany, France, Russia, Austria-Hungary, had spent years building up their armies and navies to frightening sizes. Germany alone had doubled its military budget in 20 years. Britain responded by building the most powerful naval fleet in history. War wasn't just possible, it felt almost inevitable. Alliances. Europe had divided itself into 2 heavily armed camps. The Triple Entente, Britain, France, and Russia on one side. The Triple Alliance, Germany, Austria-Hungary, and Italy on the other. These were mutual defense agreements, which meant if one country went to war, every country went to war, like a row of dominoes, perfectly arranged to fall. European empires had spent the 19th century carving up Africa, Asia, and the Middle East. By 1914, competition for colonies had created deep resentment and rivalry, especially between Britain and Germany, who felt the world's resources were being divided unfairly. Nationalism. This was perhaps the most explosive force of all. Across Europe, especially in the Balkans, ethnic groups were demanding independence. Borders were contested, and the idea of a greater Serbia or a greater Germany was setting hearts on fire. The Balkans had already been called the powder keg of Europe. It needed only one spark, and that spark? His name was Gavrilo Princip, a young Bosnian Serb nationalist, member of a secret society called the Black Hand, who believed that killing the heir to the Austro-Hungarian throne, Archduke Franz Ferdinand, would free his people. So on that summer morning in Sarajevo, he pulled the trigger, twice, and the dominoes began to fall. Austria-Hungary blamed Serbia for the assassination and issued an ultimatum: 48 hours to comply with sweeping demands. Serbia refused. Austria declared war. Russia, Serbia's protector, began to mobilize. Germany declared war on Russia, then on France, then invaded Belgium, which forced Britain into the war. Within 6 weeks of those 2 gunshots, nearly every major power on Earth was at war. Germany's plan, known as the Schlieffen Plan, was to knock out France in 6 weeks with a lightning sweep through Belgium, then rush east to deal with Russia. It was an elegant plan on paper. In reality, it collapsed almost immediately. The French and British held the Germans at the Marne River in September 1914, and both sides began digging in. And thus began one of history's most horrifying chapters: trench warfare. Imagine digging a hole in the ground and calling it home. Imagine standing knee-deep in freezing mud for weeks. Imagine the constant thunder of artillery. Imagine going over the top, climbing out of your trench, and running toward machine gun fire, knowing that most of the men beside you would not make it back. The Western Front, a line of trenches stretching 700 kilometers from Belgium to Switzerland, became a killing machine unlike anything in human history. 2 massive armies faced each other, neither able to advance more than a few kilometers for 4 years. The Battle of the Somme in 1916 saw 60,000 British soldiers killed or wounded on the first single day of battle, still one of the bloodiest days in military history. The Battle of Verdun lasted 10 months and killed 700,000 men, with almost no strategic gain for either side. And it wasn't just France. On the Eastern Front, Russia bled against Germany and Austria-Hungary. In the Middle East, the Ottoman Empire crumbled. In Africa, colonial troops were drawn into a European war they had nothing to do with. This was for the first time truly a world war. New weapons of horrifying efficiency were deployed: poison gas, flamethrowers, tanks, airplanes used for combat. Warfare would never be the same again. By 1917, the war had ground on for 3 years. Populations were exhausted. Economies were broken. And two events would change everything. First, Russia. 3 years of catastrophic defeats, millions of dead soldiers, food shortages, and a crumbling Tsar finally triggered a revolution. In February 1917, the Russian monarchy collapsed. By October, the Bolsheviks, led by Lenin, seized power. Russia pulled out of the war entirely, signing the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk with Germany in 1918. This freed up German troops from the east. It looked, for a moment, like Germany might still win. Second, America. The United States had tried to stay out of the war, but German submarines were attacking American ships. And then British intelligence intercepted something extraordinary: the Zimmermann telegram, in which Germany secretly proposed a military alliance with Mexico against the United States. America was furious. In April 1917, the U.S. entered the war on the side of the Allies. Fresh troops, fresh supplies, fresh momentum. Germany launched one last desperate offensive in spring 1918, the Spring Offensive, also called Operation Michael. They pushed deep into Allied lines. For a moment, Paris seemed reachable. But the Allied armies held, counterattacked, and began pushing Germany back, mile by mile. Inside Germany, things were collapsing. Sailors mutinied. Workers revolted. The Kaiser abdicated. And on the 11th hour of the 11th day of the 11th month of 1918, at 11 a.m. on November 11th, the guns fell silent. The Great War was over. Here is one of history's darkest ironies. The peace treaty that ended World War I was so brutal, so humiliating, so economically devastating for Germany that it practically guaranteed a second war. The Treaty of Versailles, signed in June 1919, forced Germany to accept full blame for the war, the infamous War Guilt Clause. Germany had to pay 132 billion gold marks in reparations, an almost impossible sum. It lost 13% of its territory. Its army was slashed to 100,000 men. Its navy was gutted. Entire German-speaking populations were handed to foreign nations. Germany was humiliated, economically strangled, and politically destabilized. Through the 1920s, Germany suffered catastrophic hyperinflation. At one point, a loaf of bread cost billions of marks. The Great Depression of 1929 wiped out what little recovery there had been. Millions of Germans were unemployed, desperate, and furious. Into this chaos stepped a man named Adolf Hitler, a decorated World War I veteran who blamed Germany's defeat not on military failure, but on betrayal. He called it the stab in the back. He promised to restore German greatness. He promised revenge against the humiliation of Versailles. And millions of desperate, angry, humiliated Germans believed him. The maps drawn at Versailles also created new conflict across the Middle East, the Balkans, and Eastern Europe, drawing borders that cut through ethnic groups, created minority populations, and sowed seeds of resentment that would fuel wars for the rest of the 20th century. World War I didn't end with the Treaty of Versailles. It simply took a 20-year intermission and came back with tanks, bombers, and Holocaust. You might think World War I is ancient history, something in textbooks, something that couldn't possibly affect your life today. But look closer, and the fingerprints of the Great War are everywhere. The Middle East. The borders of Iraq, Syria, Lebanon, Jordan, Israel, and Palestine were largely drawn by Britain and France after World War I, through the Sykes-Picot Agreement, with almost no regard for ethnic, religious, or tribal realities on the ground. These artificial borders created the sectarian tensions and conflicts that continue to define the region today. The Israeli-Palestinian conflict, the Iraqi Civil War, the Syrian crisis. Their roots go back to 1916 maps drawn in London and Paris. The fall of empires. World War I destroyed 4 empires: the Ottoman, the Austro-Hungarian, the Russian, and the German. Their collapse created dozens of new nations, many of them unstable, many of them still struggling with the identities forced upon them. The ethnic tensions in the Balkans that sparked World War I in the first place erupted again in the 1990s, in the Yugoslav Wars and the Bosnian Genocide. The United Nations. After the horror of World War I, Woodrow Wilson proposed the League of Nations, the world's first attempt at an international peacekeeping body. It failed, but it was the direct predecessor to the United Nations, founded after World War II, which still governs international relations today. Modern medicine. The sheer scale of casualties in World War I drove extraordinary advances in surgery, blood transfusions, and battlefield medicine. Plastic surgery was pioneered to reconstruct the faces of wounded soldiers. Shell shock, what we now call PTSD, was first recognized as a real condition during World War I, changing the course of psychiatry forever. Technology. Tanks, aircraft, submarines, chemical weapons, radio communications. All of these were either invented or massively developed during World War I. The war essentially created the technological framework for modern warfare and for modern transportation and communication. Women's rights. With millions of men at the front, women entered the workforce en masse for the first time, in factories, hospitals, offices, and farms. The contribution of women during World War I was undeniable, and in country after country, it directly led to women gaining the right to vote in the years following the war. 20 million people died in World War I. They died in trenches filled with mud and rats. They died from gas that burned their lungs. They died charging machine guns across no man's land because generals with maps 100 miles away told them to. Most of them were ordinary men, farmers, students, shopkeepers, who had never wanted war. They were sent to fight for empires, alliances, and the ambitions of leaders they never chose. And when the guns finally fell silent on November 11th, 1918, the world they left behind was unrecognizable. The old order was gone, for empires had vanished. A generation of young men had been wiped out, and the peace that followed was so flawed, so cruel, that it set the stage for an even greater catastrophe just 20 years later. World War I is not ancient history. It is the origin story of the modern world. Every border dispute, every refugee crisis, every geopolitical conflict you see today has roots, often direct roots, in the decisions made between 1914 and 1919. Understanding this war isn't just about knowing the past. It's about understanding why the world is the way it is. If this video helped you see history in a new way, leave a comment below. Tell me, which part shocked you the most? And if you want to go deeper, the next video covers World War II, how Hitler used the wounds of World War I to set the entire world on fire again. You don't want to miss it. So subscribe, hit the bell, and I'll see you in the next one.